Welcome back to part 4 of this Django course, where I'll be taking you through how to write production-ready API views using the Django REST Framework. And we'll be connecting these to serializers and making use of pagination, filtering, and even custom actions. So let's dive into it. So every full-stack application needs well-structured and efficient views to power its API, whether you're serving thousands of requests a day or just building for future scale. How your views handle your data, including things like filtering, pagination, and custom actions, makes all the difference. Now, if you missed part 3, where we built the serializers, which are then going to feed into these views, then definitely go back and visit that part. Otherwise, let's start talking about views. And there's many different types of views that you can make use of within the Django REST framework. Some of the most common would include the API views, the different types of generic views, and then ViewSets as well. And I'm going to briefly touch on each of these, and then we'll focus on one of these to start off with. So to get started, you are going to want to install these packages, which include the Django REST Framework, some nested routing packages, and the Django Filter package as well. Now that we've installed the Django REST Framework, we're going to want to add some configuration within our settings.py file. All the rest of the settings can stay the same from the previous part of this course, but now we have some specific classes that we can add into the REST framework configuration. Now at this point, we haven't added any authentication into the backend, and that's fine. This will come later on in the course. So all of the endpoints are going to be publicly available. This second block here actually sets the default filter backends for our API views. This will make more sense when we start actually building the views. But basically what this will do is embed built-in parameter query filtering into your APIs without having to set this up yourself, which is really powerful. The next one is pagination. So once again, Django is great because it comes with all this functionality pretty much out of the box. And if you've ever built an API from scratch, you've probably had to deal with something like pagination before. Now you can create your own pagination class, or you can just make use of some of the pagination classes that the Django REST framework comes with. And once again, this will make much more sense when we actually start testing these APIs. This setting after the default pagination class basically tells us what the default page size is, so we're just going to choose 25 for this. And then you can also set things like the throttle rates and throttle classes if you wanted to as well. I won't be touching too much on these now because we will be covering them later on in the course. But the main things here that I wanted to focus on is the filter backends and the pagination. So let's copy this and let's put it into our settings.py file. Like so. Great. As I mentioned, there are many different types of views that you can create, and I'm going to talk about 3 different types and then mainly focus on one. So if you use the API view, and obviously you want to take a somewhat agnostic approach when you're building your APIs. So it's good to understand all the different types and then choose which is best for your use case. So an API view gives you maximum control. You implement the HTTP verbs, the handlers yourself. This is great if you need to build a lot of custom logic, really good for webhooks, somewhat unusual or unique request passing, and also for streaming. Now the generic views, this gives you coverage of most common CRUD use cases with pretty minimal code. So for example, you can create a view which out of the box gives you a list endpoint and a create endpoint. And similarly, you can get a retrieve, update, destroy API view, which gives you get, update, and delete API endpoints. And then finally, the ViewSets, which is actually what we're going to be focusing on this video. This is a great choice for RESTful resources. And the great thing about this is that the routers will generate the routes for you based on the model names and the actions. This is best for RESTful resources, and the routers will generate the routes for you, which is really powerful. So you can start to build out quite a comprehensive set of APIs very quickly with minimal code. And because everything is somewhat managed for you and abstracted by these classes, it makes things really repeatable and predictable. And then on top of that, what we can do with the model view set is we can actually add custom actions as well, for when you need to extend your view classes past just the standard CRUD verbs. This will make more sense when we come to it as well. So, first thing that we need to do is we are going to add some permissions into our application. Now in your views, you have sort of like standard permissions that you can make use of. So for example, is the user authenticated, or you can use the allow only permission. But then you can add custom permissions as well, which might check things such as somebody's enrollment in a course, or whether their profile is verified, and so on. So within the core application, I'm going to create a new file called permissions, and I'm going to create this read-only permission. And the main reason for this is just because all the endpoints that we are going to create right now are going to be public endpoints. But we can swap this out later and add more permissions when we want to add user level control or role-based access. So now let's get started on some views. So within the core application, once again, I'm going to come into the views file. I'm going to replace this boilerplate code that we had before, and I'm going to import some different classes. So we've got some REST framework imports up here, and then we've basically just got some imports from Django and from the models and serializers that we've used before. So that's pretty simple. Now we're going to create a view for the courses. Let me copy this and then I'll explain it a little bit more. So this is the top level definition of the course view set. As you can see, we're making use of the model view set here. And a lot of the legwork of this view is actually taken care of just by defining these different attributes as part of the class. So because of the settings that we set up, including the Django Filters backend, all of these fields here basically give us a discrete definition on how we can filter these models via the API. So we're basically saying from this line here that if somebody calls this API and includes one of these fields in the query parameters with a following value associated with it, then we can filter by this value. The second line, this search fields, this enables by default the query parameter of search to be passed within the URL. And what that search parameter will do is it will look for the value in the URL, and it will search these three fields from the course model to decide whether or not they're relevant. Similarly, with the ordering fields, by making use of this attribute here, this enables you to actually pass one of these three fields as the value to a key called ordering in the URL. So you can have custom control over the ordering of the values that are returned from the API. And then this final value basically just gives us sort of like a default ordering for any data when we haven't passed in the ordering field here. So that's quite a lot of information, and it might not make entire sense right now, but when we start to build the API calls, it'll make a lot more sense. Just a few of the other attributes here as well, which you'll see commonly repeated across some of the other API classes that we'll set up. So the reason why setting up the serializers was so important last time is because we're going to make use of these serializers in the views. This not only allows us to control how we create and update data in the database, but it also gives us control over how the data is going to be serialized in our responses when we make requests to the API. So by defining the serializer class within our API view, basically just standardizes the format that we not only receive data when we're creating or updating data, but then also the way that we get data back from the API as well. So the definitions that we created for these serializer classes will be reflected in some of the data that we get back from the APIs very shortly. And then the final piece here is the query set attribute. This is basically a definition of the data that needs to be collected when this view is called. And there's two things to note here, really. You might have seen ORM sort of like definitions that look something like this. So course.objects.filter or maybe .all, right? But there are several optimizations that you can make when making database queries. So the first is by using this selected related method, and the second is by using this prefetched related method. Now if I come back over to the documentation, we use select related for single valued relationships. And we also use prefetch related to optimize the number of database queries for many-to-many relationships or reverse relationships. So what you can often find if you have to retrieve nested relationships between models is that not only are you making a query for the top level model, but then when you nest within that model and you then need to query another related model, then you have to make another database query. And you can get into this situation where you essentially have something that's usually referred to as like n+1 queries. Essentially what it means is you end up querying the database way more than you actually need to. So we can make use of these two methods to optimize the number of queries that get sent to the database. So that's quite a lot of information about all of these different attributes within the definition of the API class, but these will be somewhat consistent across the classes, and it will make much more sense when we actually start to dive into it. So just very quickly, once again, when I look at this prefetch related method, you can see in here, I'm basically telling this query set to prefetch all of these many-to-many relationships that the course has with all of these fields. Okay, so now moving on, if I scroll a little bit further down, you can see here we've actually implemented what we consider a custom action. Now by default, when you use the model ViewSet class, you actually get 5 CRUD endpoints. So you get get, you get post, you get with ID, you get patch with ID, and you get delete with ID. So as an example, this could look like get courses, and then post courses, and then get courses with an ID, and then patch courses with an ID, and a similar patch courses with an ID. So simply just by defining our API view like this, out of the box we get 5 CRUD endpoints, which is brilliant. However, as explained earlier, sometimes you need additional endpoints that fall outside of these sort of 5 CRUD verbs. So this is where you can define a custom action. So here, you make use of the action handler. By specifying detail equals to true, this basically tells this endpoint that it's going to need an ID field. If you set it equals to false, then it applies to a whole array of objects, not just one specific one. Essentially, in this case, it applied to the entire query set rather than one specific course. And we define the method as well. So in this case, post. And what this handler will do is it will essentially publish a course. So it will take the primary key, which is passed in the URL from this field here. It will get this course. It will set is published equals to true, and then it will save this course and just return a simple sort of like success message at the end. So what this endpoint will look like is we already have a post endpoint. However, it will map this endpoint to this URL. So it'll be courses ID publish. And the reason why we have publish at the end is because this is what the name of the function is. And there is also another field that we can pass in here to allocate it to a custom route as well. So that's a bit of background. Now let me show you some other views, and then we'll actually get into testing some of these. So we've done the course view set. Now let's have a look at the module view set. So similarly, we define our query sets. This is the data that's going to get retrieved when this API is called. We define our serializer class and the same filtering and ordering fields as well. Obviously, the values of these arrays will be slightly different because we're now looking at a module and no longer a course. Now in this first view, we didn't need to define this get query set handler. And that's because this handler is already built in by default. The reason why we're overriding this handler here is because there's some custom logic that we need to implement. And this is basically going to help us later when we start looking at nested routing. So in this first view, it was fairly simple because we didn't really need any kind of like nested logic here. But we're essentially just overriding this handler here just to add a little bit of custom logic. And then once again, with the model ViewSet API view, as I explained before, this already comes built in with all of those different CRUD verbs. However, for our create verb here, we're actually overriding this once again just to allow us to handle the logic for the nested routes that we're going to create. So aside from overriding the gathering of the query set and the default creation logic, everything else is the same here. We get all the same 5 endpoints. And now let's move on to the lesson view set. Let's copy this and let's paste it in here. This is very similar. We're defining it in a fairly uniform way. Once again, we're overriding the query set, we're overriding the create handler, but we're also adding one custom action at the end as well. So this class is for the lessons, and basically what this custom action is doing at the end is it is allowing the user to mark a lesson as complete. So the one difference here to compare it to the previous custom action is that we're actually adding the URL path field in now as well. Because notice if we didn't have this URL path, it will be mapped to a URL with mark_complete. We're overriding this to allocate it to mark-complete. So quite simple really. So this essentially will give us an endpoint where we can mark a lesson as complete. Okay, so that rounds it out, at least for now, for some views to get us started. There's a lot more we can do here, and we might revisit this later in the course. But we've gone over quite a lot of different concepts, so I think what will be most useful now is to actually test these. So just coming back to the README file very quickly. A few last configurations that we need to make. So although we've created all of our views here, they're currently not being routed to any URLs. So we need to update, or we need to create a urls.py file. Or in fact, we don't need to create one. We actually come into our config folder, open up urls.py, and we can basically just override everything that's here. And this is where we're making use of the nested router that we mentioned earlier. So what's happening here is that we're defining our router object, and then we're registering the 3 views that we've created, so the course view, the module view, and the lesson view, against the router. And this provides the sort of the anchor at these addresses here within the URL. However, for some of these URLs, so for example, because we have a hierarchical structure between courses, modules, and lessons, sometimes we want URLs to be routed in a nested fashion. So for example, we might want course 1, but then we want module 2 from that course. So then what we do here is we define 2 nested routers. We create a courses nested router, and we register the modules against this courses router to allow the modules to be nested within a courses URL. And similarly, we do the same thing with the modules router. And this is because, once again, lessons are almost like a child of the parent module. So we want to be able to query the lessons APIs in a nested fashion from within the modules. So we're doing the same thing here. And then we just include these different routers in our URL patterns. This will all start to make a lot more tangible sense once we start testing and writing out some APIs in Postman. So that's good. We're making really good progress. And just revisiting some of the points that I made earlier around the filtering, search, and pagination. Once again, we'll see some of this when we test this in Postman. But here's an example of some of the API endpoints and how you can make use of the filtering. So if I come back to the courses view, remember, we defined this field here, filter set fields, and we defined is published, tags, and topics within that array. So if I just move this side by side, notice here, if I make an API call to the courses endpoint, and then I pass is published as a parameter query equals to true, then it will return just the courses that have been published. And I can continue to concatenate more of these filter set fields onto this API query as well. And then notice this ordering field. Now by default, the ordering actually uses created at in a descending fashion anyway. However, by passing an ordering key with a value, and this value needs to be one of these 3 values here, so essentially created at, updated at, or name, then you can order in ascending or descending order, as well as other sort of like variations of that. So by putting a minus in front of the created at, we're basically asking for all of the courses that have been published in descending order of being created. And then similarly, I mentioned this search field as well. So by us enabling the search filter in the backend, and by adding this search fields definition here, it allows the addition of a search parameter to be passed in the URL, and then a string to be following that. And whatever string this is the value that's going to be used to search these 3 fields in the database. So basically, this is going to return to us all of the courses that have either their name, slug, or description containing the string Django. So it's really clever, and it actually gives you a lot of functionality with very little work. So let's start testing some of these endpoints. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to close some of these files just to kind of clean things up a little bit over here. I'm going to bring this over, I'm going to leave it here for now actually. I'm going to open up Postman, and I'm going to open up some of these API definitions that I've created. Of course, I need to run the server as well. So let's run the server. Let's open this up a bit so we can see what's coming through on the server. Let's make this a bit bigger as well. Okay, as I mentioned before, all of these endpoints for now are public. You don't require any authentication to use them. We will go through this later on in the course. But starting at the top, so let's just open up the views file again, sorry. So let's just go in order. So we'll start with the courses, then we'll go to the modules, and then we'll go to the lessons in chronological order and in hierarchical order. So if we look at this endpoint here, this is one of the built-in CRUD verbs that already gets allocated because we're using the model ViewSet API. So if I simply call this, look at the response that we get back. Now the only thing that we sort of defined in terms of the response structure was essentially the serializer. So if you look at what this serializer is returning, it's providing us all the data about this course, including the many-to-many fields like the tags, the topics, the instructors, the modules. But if you'll notice from the previous lesson, it's following the exact same structure that we defined in the serializer. And if you remember, we used nested serializers as well. That's why all of these many-to-many fields, or some of these many-to-many fields like the instructors, is also giving us a serialized response. So by telling the course ViewSet that we're going to be using serializer class of course serializer, it automatically formats all of the data into this results array respecting this serializer class, which is brilliant. And then there's a few additional fields as well. And this is what comes from the Pagination class within the Django REST Framework. Now this is quite simple. It gives you a count of the number of objects and whether there's another page or a previous page. And in this example, there is no next or previous page. You can customize this further to include more information, such as the number of items on each page, the number of pages, and you can even implement your own custom class for pagination too. But we're already getting quite a lot here, so this is actually great for now. So then, as I mentioned earlier, we get another get endpoint by default using the model ViewSet, which is where we specify an ID. So now we essentially append an ID at the end of the URL, and if I send this, now it will just return me the data for this specific course. No pagination, just the serialized data for this course. That's great. One of the other additional CRUD verbs that we get out of the box is the post endpoint. So we use the same root URL, API/courses. We pass in some data to create this course. And here we go. We get our serialized response. Now we've got a third course. And now I can update this course if I want to. So if I come to the patch verb and I change this ID to the ID of the course that I just created, let's call it test course 3, and I patch this, now you can see the name of this course is test course 3 and the ID has stayed the same. So that's exactly what we want. Now this has just been a test course, so let's delete this now. Let's get rid of this. We pass in the ID of the course, we use the delete verb, and we send this and we get a 204 no content response, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, let me come out of this. Let me go back to the get endpoint. We're still just getting one result because we just created and then deleted a course. Now remember, in our course ViewSet, we get all of the 5 default CRUD operations or CRUD verbs that I just mentioned. So get courses, get course by ID, create course, update course, and delete course. But then remember, we created this custom action, publish. So we actually have an additional endpoint here as well, this publish course endpoint. Now it specifies that detail equals to true, which means that we do need to pass an ID in the URL, and then we simply just append publish to the end. So what this is going to do is it's going to fetch the course with ID equals to 1, and it's going to set is published equals to true. So I'll send this and I get a success message back. And then I've actually got one more endpoint here as well, which is get the featured courses. Now I know this is going to come back with nothing because this endpoint doesn't currently exist, but what I can do is I can very quickly create a custom action. So this is going to be action detail equals to false, methods equals to get, define featured, and luckily Copilot is going to give us a little bit of a lending hand here. We don't want to filter by is featured, we want to filter by is published. then it's going to paginate the results, and then it should return us some information. So let's do this. Let's test this out now. Let's come back to my Postman and let's do this. And here we go. Yeah. So very quickly I can create another endpoint with a different ending, i.e. just to fetch the featured courses, and yeah, really easy and really simple to set up. So out of the box, you get a lot of functionality by using these model view sets. Obviously, depending on your use case, you might not necessarily want to utilize them, but if your APIs are going to be very tightly coupled to your database models and your serializers, then it makes complete sense. And then you can always add in custom logic here as well anyway. Let's close these now, and let's have a look at some of the other API endpoints. So let's come to the modules. Let's go one step down in the hierarchy. Let's just open up the model view set as well. Okay. So notice here that we've got pretty much the same 5 CRUD verbs once again. We've got get by ID, we've got create, we've got update, and we've got delete. And that's because we haven't implemented any additional custom actions. The only logic here that we've implemented is some custom logic to override the getting the query set and the creation of a new module. So let's have a look at these. We already know that there is a course with ID equals to 1, so we'll just put this in the URL here, and let's get the modules that are associated with this. So here you'll see that we get the serialized response for the modules. And let me just move this over to this side as well. Okay, so then similarly, I can now get a module by its ID. So notice how the URL changes. We now pass the course ID, then the module ID, and this is where we're making use of the nested routing. Because we assigned the modules within the courses nested router, that's why all of this kind of gets appended to each other. So we're kind of traversing down the tree. We're saying, okay, look in the courses, give me course 1, then go into the modules and give me module 1. And so by defining the URLs with that nested router setup, let me just expand this once again very quickly. So the top level structure is the courses, which uses this string here. And then we're registering the modules against this courses router. So that's why it becomes nested. Okay, so let's send this, and yeah, we get the expected response. We get the serialized response for the module within this course. If I was to, I don't know, say like 10 or something like that, yeah, we get an error. It basically tells us that this module doesn't exist, and that is true because there's only one module. We can then create a module. Very similar, once again, uses the nested structure. We tell it which course we want to create the module for, and then we just pass some data into the body. This creates our module for us. We can update this module. Let's call it 3. Let's update the name to 3. We get the updated name, perfect. And then we can delete this module. Done. So let's close these. Let's just come back here and query what modules we've got once again. And yeah, we just get one module once again, as expected. And then now let's move on to the lessons. So very similarly, once again, with the lessons, because the setup has been fairly similar, we're going to get all the same CRUD variables, all the same CRUD verbs again. There is some custom logic that we've implemented to kind of override the getting the query set and the creation, but we've also added a custom action as well, which I'll cover too. So I'm not going to sort of like repeat this so much. I think you kind of get the overall flow. Once again, this time we're using the nested structure for modules. We're no longer using the nested structure for courses. This is because, if you remember, we registered the lessons string against the nested router for the modules. So, we run this query, we get our lessons within the module. Simple. Then we can get a lesson by ID, as expected, and you can continue to create, update, and delete these lessons as well. But the final thing that I want to focus on is this last action, which is the mark complete action. So if you remember, we defined this using a method of mark_complete, but then we assigned it to a URL path of mark-complete. So if I open this up, it uses the nested structure. So we're looking at module 1, lesson 1, and we want to mark this as complete. And it's not using an underscore, it's now using a dash because we mapped this to a specific URL path. Now, as you may notice if you're following along with this endpoint isn't actually going to work. And the reason why is because the lesson progress object requires a user object to be assigned to it. However, because all these endpoints are unauthenticated at the moment, there's no user object to use. So this is really a placeholder for later on when we do add authentication. But if I make a request to this endpoint, it's going to give me a 500 error. And you can come into the preview tab and you can sort of scroll through this debug panel, which can be very useful sometimes, but essentially it's because of the exact reason that I just told you. But that's fine for now, because we've kind of got all the functionality that we intended anyway. Okay, so that wraps it up for everything I was going to take you through today on creating production-ready API views and predominantly focusing on the model ViewSet class. We covered a lot. It's definitely worth you going over this and testing it for yourself and trying to run this locally on your own machine. But we're starting to see how all these components come together. The database models, the serializers, and now the API views. So if you like this video and you're enjoying this course overall, then please leave a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so that you're notified when the next part of this course comes out. And if you're really enjoying diving into Django and backend development, then definitely check out the rest of this course and some of my other videos, such as my top 10 tips on Django. But for now, I'll see you soon.